Hello, everyone. Whilst it's dead on the hour, we'll just hang on for another couple of minutes just for the those that are trying to join us to get in. So I'll be with you shortly. Well, welcome back, everyone, to our monthly research seminar. It's good to have you back with us. Look, wherever you are in the country, and irrespective of your lockdown status, we do hope you and yours are well and staying safe. My name's Dave Lamb. I'm the Chief Scientist of Food Agility CRC, and I'll be your MC for the seminar. I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands and waters on which we all live and work. I'd also particularly like to acknowledge the Anawan people as the First Nations owners of the lands from where our presenter is presenting from. That is Armidale in the New England region of New South Wales. I'd like to pay respects to the elders of all of these lands and waters, both past, present, and emerging. For those of you who are new to our seminar series, welcome. If you're unfamiliar with Food Agility, we are a cooperative research centre dedicated to unlocking the power of data and digital to transform our agri-food sector. Now, before I introduce our speaker, just a quick reminder on some housekeepings. Firstly, the session is being recorded, and ultimately we'll make the recording available to you. We welcome questions, and please use the Q&A tab, not the chat tab, but the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Now, whilst it's not possible for you to ask questions directly of the presenter yourself, if you put your question in the Q&A tab, I'll work through those posted and follow up with the presenter on your behalf. And of course, if you still have a burning desire to follow up directly with the presenter, then please feel free to reach out after the event. So now to our seminar topic. Thanks to innovative means of collecting data in the field, the factory, the lab, through written or verbal interviews, you name it, our thirst for knowledge and insights is being fed by data. Often there's too much, or more correctly, more data than we can handle, or even more correctly, data in a form we just can't handle. But is that really the case? In the famous English poem, The Ancient Mariner, Samuel Taylor Coleridge reflects on a sailor's experiences during a long sea journey. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. And I wonder if a modern day adaptation concerning our research lives is around data, data everywhere, but does it help us think? As we reach more and more for data in our thirst for knowledge, and we tackle more sophisticated interactions within and between data, we're increasingly reliant upon the power of the computer, not just to process the data, but to render it in a form that we can understand. Computing power and the way we render results can really help us think. And when it comes to the way we render results, the power of visualization comes into play. In some respects, we're talking about the art of analytics. And this is the topic of today's seminar: computer vision, machine learning, and simulation in agriculture and ecology research. It's with great pleasure that I introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Mitchell Welch from the University of New England up here in Armidale. Mitch is currently working as a senior lecturer at the university, having previously worked as a software engineer, focusing on the development and customization of cloud-hosted software, database systems, and the integration of platforms that connect enterprise information systems together. For the past 7 years, Mitch has worked on a range of research projects focusing on data science, machine learning, and high-performance computing. And more recently, Mitch's research has focused on developing simulations that allow for the experimentation on the rules of interaction that govern the movement of teams and groups of animals. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Mitch, and over to you, Mitch, for your seminar.
Thanks for the introduction there. I'll just go and get the screen sharing happening here. There we go. Just get some slides up. There we go. Switch that one around. There we go. So thanks for the introduction. As Dave mentioned, I'm working at the University of New England, and I work in the computational science discipline there. And we spend a lot of time working on projects in agriculture, ecology, and more recently in sports science as well. And so a lot of those projects have a high performance computing element to them. And so today I'm going to run through what it really means to implement research and processing at scale, some of the high performance computing technologies that are available, that are readily available either through the national computing infrastructure, but also many institutions have these sort of in their departments. And then I'm going to go through a bit of a medley of some of the research projects that we've worked on. And they cover things like, as Dave has mentioned, computer vision, agent-based simulation, machine learning, and the big data elements of them that often lead to the scale of the processing involved. A little bit of background to this presentation. So I teach the parallel and distributed computing courses at UNE, and we have lots of students that are very interested in learning how to use high performance computing systems, both for research and just general interest. And so over the years, we've taught a lot of students on how to use technologies like message passing interface, which is the platform used on the national computing infrastructure to develop these really high-end research algorithms. And it's really good to see that there's such an interest in this. But when we start explaining to students how to think about computing power, we really talk about it at 3 levels. And so we have things that we can achieve on our desktop machine. So a desktop machine typically has somewhere between 8 and 16 cores. It'll have tens of gigabytes of memory. And so it can process millions of rows of data in an Excel spreadsheet, or it can process relatively simple algorithms in packages like MATLAB and R, but you have limited memory and speed. So it's really hard to do really large machine learning problems, really large simulation problems, because the number of interactions simply become too great. And that's when we start moving up to servers, and a server will typically have hundreds of cores. And a server is something that a typical university department will have access to. So this is something you'll usually have on site. And so it'll have hundreds of gigabytes of memory. And you can start doing some meaningful multi-process programming on these systems. You can start training some sort of relatively complex machine learning algorithms, and that they can host really large databases. And when we get to the point where we're dealing with really, really big data sets, lots of interactions, lots of processing, that's when we move up to our true high performance computing systems. So this is the type of stuff that's provided by big data centers. And so in Australia, we have the National Computational Infrastructure that offers systems with thousands and thousands of cores, thousands of gigabytes of memory, and it's all distributed. It's divided amongst systems that are physically separated. So on our desktops, we'll typically do sort of simple modeling, so ANOVAs, GLMs, hypothesis tests. And if we try to use our machine learning algorithms, they're going to be limited. We're going to be limited by the amount of tuning that we can do, the number of features we can use, but it will get us started. And so same with our agent-based simulations. If we've got individuals, lots of interactions going on, the complexity and scale is going to be limited. We can move up to our servers. And so this is just a screenshot of the activity on our server, one of our servers that we have here at, in computational science. And so this is where you can tune a meaningful number of hyperparameters on a machine learning algorithm. And you can start building some agent-based models that have sort of thousands of agents and doing a meaningful number of trials on those. And we can get to where we can have some true big data storage with millions upon millions of sort of rows of data. And the most useful aspect of these intermediate server systems is that they're a test bed for larger HPC systems. So we run a virtual cluster and we train students on this virtual cluster so that they can write software for the NCI infrastructure that will ultimately run in the large data centers. And so this gives us our sort of springboard to develop our research and then deploy them. So to put some perspective on this, this is just one of our servers in computer science, has 64 cores, 256 gigabytes of memory. This is what we have available at the National Computational Infrastructure. It's got a total of 155,000 CPU cores, terabytes of memory, and it has 640 GPUs. These are graphics processing units, which are used for general purpose processing within machine learning algorithms. And we'll talk about those very shortly. And so you can see that this type of machine, this class of machine, is sort of a cut above anything that you can sort of realistically have within an organization. So it's there, and you can use parts of this system. You'll rarely use, you'll never use the whole system, but you'll certainly be able to use individual cores and individual GPUs or collections of them for processing in your experiments. And so we've got these different tiers of machines, and so the scale of the processing that we want to use on them, we want to complete on them, is governed by the size of the data set involved, and also the complexity of the processing. And so, with modern techniques, we're able to ultimately collect very large data sets, whether that's experimentally through the use of sensors, whether we're crowdsourcing data from a lot of different sources. Those data sets get very big, and you'll see in some of the research later on using things like RFID positional tracking systems. We're able to collect very large data sets from production systems within, for example, for laying hens in sheds of thousands and thousands of hens. And so that creates a very large processing overhead. Likewise, the complexity of the processing, so the connections, the number of interactions that you're analyzing, you're simulating, you're trying to get information out of, is going to exacerbate that. And so here we've just got an example of some social media analysis. And so each of these nodes represents a particular social media account, and this particular group were researching the influence of fake news. And you can see that there's a huge amount of interconnectedness. Each of these arcs represents a connection between these particular user accounts. And so in order to analyze that and get meaningful results out of that, there's thousands upon thousands upon thousands of interactions that need to be analyzed. And so to do that takes a huge computational overhead. When we start thinking about big data, we think of the 3 V's. We've got volume, velocity, and variety. And so volume is just the raw amount of data. And so, as I mentioned before, that's often governed by our ability to collect. We're using sensors, number of individuals involved, number of organizations, and production systems. So in an agricultural context, we now have a torrent of data coming in, whether it's from positional data, both tracking machines or individual animals, or whether we're collecting this through remote sensing data, so using satellite imagery, which is very high resolution, produces lots of individual values. We have very big data sets to play with. Volume is also context sensitive. So if you have if you're processing data on edge devices, so these are devices that that sit on the edge of a network and have relatively small processors, relatively small processing power, a smaller amount of data is going to be very large for them in terms of their processing capability. Likewise, velocity gives us the rate at which that data is coming in. So again, high resolution data sets coming in very quickly. That will add up in terms of the processing overhead. And variety adds this unique difficulty to the problem, because we might have data that's coming in without any real structure. And so if you start looking at things like video feeds, audio feeds, they require pre-processing to get to really store meaningful information, or extract meaningful information and store that. And so that, again, that pre-processing brings in a lot of additional computational requirements. So you can see very quickly, by combining these three together in different ways, you can end up with projects, experimental projects and production environments that produce huge amounts of processing. Machine learning is one of these modern tools that we now see popping up everywhere. And it's a really good example of complexity and scale, because you have complex algorithms that do lots of passes, lots of combinations, and we'll see an example, see a nice infographic here in a second that displays that. But you've also got very large data sets. And so if we start bringing in millions of rows of data, in order to build a model that fits over these, we of course need to be able to manage that. And so in a typical supervised machine learning workflow, we fit a model to the data set with the aim of making future classifications and predictions. So we collect our data, we train our model, we evaluate our solutions, and we tune all of the parameters. And so I've got a nice infographic here. It's again stolen from another study, but I like it because it shows these loops of processing. So we start with our data set and we split it up into some testing and training sets. We train our algorithm on our training sets and we test them on the testing splits, and we go through parameter tuning. So all of these algorithms have some sort of parameters that govern their structure, and so we need to tune them to get the best fit. Likewise, they also have features. There's things that we calculate from our data set, and so we need to be able to select the best combinations of features. And so when you start adding these things up, there's multiple features, multiple parameters. We have this combinatorial explosion of processing where each of those combinations adds an iteration to these loops. And so when we start stacking these up, we end up with in a situation where the machine learning problem has become very computationally intense. And so that's where we need to start moving up to our servers and even using our true high performance computing architectures to really get a handle on those. And so we need to be able to tune those hyperparameters, select data features. And so if you're completing these in different combinations, you're really training millions of models to select the best one. And so by doing that, you're introducing this requirement for huge amounts of processing. Another type of machine learning algorithm that's become very popular are our deep neural networks. And so deep neural networks, they're biologically inspired. They have these neurons that activate when inputs reach a certain threshold, and then they fire off to the next layer, and so forth. And they consist of an input layer, multiple intermediate hidden layers, and then an output layer. And so each of these links between these neurons, the neurons are our nodes here, indicated by our circles. Each of these links needs to have weights and parameters tuned for them in order to ultimately produce or train a classifier for the output layer. And in order to do that, we end up with very large data sets being sent in to tune them, and very complex models. And so typically most modern deep neural networks will be trained on very high performing graphics processing units, which are essentially designed for that high throughput number crunching to do that. Again, lots of data, lots of complexity there, giving us this high performance computing problem. We can save a little bit of time on that by using what we call transfer learning. And that's where we start up with a semi or partially trained convolutional or neural network or deep neural network. So an example of that is the VGG16 network. It's pre-trained on a bunch of generic images, on a big set of generic images, and it has a structure here with multiple layers. So each of these layers represents one of these connected neuron layers. So the pixels go in, there's multiple connections, and there's some pooling layers. that aggregate this down to some classifications at the end. And so by pre-training that, we can then add our own data set on top of it to then tune it for our particular need. And so this group were using this particular network to identify water polo players for positional tracking in a swimming pool, and it improved the efficiency by using that transfer learning approach. And we'll see an example where we do this with camera trap imagery very shortly. And so that leads us to, we've talked about some of the types of processing. So we've got our complexity and our large data sets. We can now talk about some of the specific technologies that we've got to sort of to tame this parallel computing beast. And so the most common approach is to use a multi-process or multi-threaded approach, where we essentially divide the problem up amongst multiple worker processes or worker units. And so each worker processes the data in parallel, and it processes part of the problem, and then we aggregate that solution back to the master process. And usually there's some sort of aggregate operation. So if we were doing simulations with experimental results, we might run the trials and then just collect aggregate results at the end and reduce them down to some averages or a 5-number summary. Machine learning, we're really only interested in the optimal model. So at the end, we end up with the optimal trained model. In the end, the idea is that we've got multiple workers working on the same problem. And so we can master this at a very rudimentary level, just using our simple scripting languages. So we've got an example. These are sort of the Hello World introductory examples for parallel programming in R, MATLAB, and Python, which are sort of some of the common scientific and engineering packages. And so you can see that in order to produce a multi-process program, it's really simple. It usually just involves importing the library and then doing some form of setup. So in Python, you set up the process and identify the target function that it's going to start in, and then you spin off the new process, and you can do any number of those. In R, you specify the number of cores essentially, and then you have a parallel for loop. And so when you run that for loop, each iteration of the for loop, each version of the loop is essentially executed in parallel alongside one another on a separate processor. Likewise, MATLAB, it's probably the easiest one to master for parallel programming because it has a structure called a parallel or a par for loop. Again, each iteration of that loop is executed on a different processing unit, and it's able to ultimately execute them in parallel and speed things up. And so it's really easy to master it at a very high level. The key drawback here is that these languages are high-level languages, so they're interpreted. So things like memory management, all these sorts of things are managed in the background, and they're non-optimal. They're just they make assumptions about what you're trying to do, and so they're kind of wasteful, and they can be a little bit slow at times compared to some of the other technologies. And so ultimately, our speed up that we gain from parallel processing is constrained by the proportion of the code that is parallelizable. So every problem will have some aspect of it that can't be parallelized, whether that's that aggregation where we're reducing that big parallel problem down to that single result, or whether we have some element where we need to synchronize and communicate between the processes. There's elements that can't be parallelized. And so Amdahl's law, we teach this in our parallel programming class, sort of shows that if we can get to a scenario where 95% of our code is parallelizable, the maximum speed up we can get is a 20 times speed up. And so as you throw processing cores at it, you get diminishing returns on that as well, because the problem just can't be, you're just constrained by that proportion of the problem that can ultimately be parallelized. Having said that, a very small speed up on a very large problem can still give you a very big actual saving, a very, very big real world saving. So it still very much makes sense to parallelize and make use of high performance computing for our problems. It's really the only way to work with some of these really big problems. And so the other cool technology that's come in over the last decade, or it's a little bit more than a decade, are graphics processing unit technologies for general purpose processing. So once upon a time, graphics processing units were developed ultimately for presenting graphics on end user machines, and also for rendering 3D graphics, so for movies and simulations and things like that. And so these devices have now evolved into what are really general purpose, highly parallel number crunching devices. And so the explanation for why they're so specialized is essentially in their structure. And we've got a couple of block diagrams over here. And essentially the green areas in these diagrams represents the transistors that are devoted to processing. And so you can see that in a typical CPU, you have big control units, which control things like branch execution, speculative execution, so they give fast result times, and then they've got the core processing units. These are the arithmetic logic units that do the actual number crunching. In a GPU, you have your control unit that's in charge of multiple processing units, multiple arithmetic logic units, and a very large proportion of those transistors are devoted to those arithmetic logic units for doing that parallel number crunching. So they're not geared for responsiveness or speculative execution to give good user experience. They're geared for number crunching. And so that's why they're used for things like training our machine learning models, things like high performance weather simulations. And they're also used for crypto mining, because crypto mining involves doing lots of these hash operations, which are number crunching operations. And so they've found their way into that particular use as well. But we have access to these devices just in our desktop computers. And they offer a very good processing alternative to the CPU, because they have very high number of floating point operations per second. And so here we have some examples of industrial processing cards. This infographic's a little bit old. It's from 2014, 2015, but you can see that they outstrip CPUs by quite a margin. And so we have one of these K80s from a few years ago, and it gets used quite often for training TensorFlow deep learning models. And so it's a very, very good alternative to sort of waiting on the CPU. We can do a lot of parallel processing in those. And there's general purpose libraries in most of the popular scripting languages. In our courses here, we teach students to program them natively using C and C++. And of course, TensorFlow is a GPU machine learning library that has bindings to Python and MATLAB that allows users to access it through that. So GPUs are a really good option, even when you're using the consumer cards that are available in your desktop machines. So the final technology involves message passing interface, and this is for use on truly distributed computing systems. Essentially, if you're working on the NCI infrastructure where you've got multiple servers that are connected by a network bus, you need to use something that allows you to pass information between them to build those aggregate results. And we do that using message passing interface, which is a low-level programming library that allows us to specify what a process really does. And a typical MPI program, this is sort of the hello world, the first program that the kids learn in parallel and distributed computing. It essentially involves, it executes on every node, and each node has to work out which rank it is, what processor it is, and then carry out some processing according to that. So if it's the root process 0, usually it's in charge of sending out all of the information out to the workers. And if it's a worker, it has to do the actual processing. And so that's done on a mass scale across thousands and thousands of processes, and those results are ultimately sent back to that root process for aggregation. So this is the technology that underpins all of those really heavyweight scientific computing experiments. So that really covers off on our technology set. And so for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to go through a bit of a roadshow of some of the projects that sit within the computer science discipline at UNE with the researchers there. And it also includes a lot of researchers from across UNE and beyond. And really, they're just they use a range of these parallel computing technologies to really speed them up, and in some of them, it's the only real way to make them possible. So the first one we've got here is Eddie Sadgrove's research on weed detection using computer vision. So he's using one of these deep neural network systems. So it's actually an extreme learning machine, which is a slightly different type of neural network system for the detection of weeds. And here we've got some samples where he's detecting thistles using drone footage. And ultimately, they're able to train these with a fairly high accuracy. They vary by season and by stage. So thistles have various different growth stages, and they can detect them to different levels of accuracy in those different stages. Ultimately, though, they want to get this research working on one of these autonomous vehicles. So you'll have spray rigs and other devices attached to those that allow for targeted sort of green on green spraying. Here we've got an example where they're detecting tussock in amongst what appears to be ryegrass and other bits and pieces in there, wiregrass and ryegrass. And so they're using, in this case, they're using their extreme learning machines and some traditional color feature networks to detect those, and ultimately that will be processed live on that device. That device is called the Kelpie. It'll be an autonomous spraying drone, and so that research is currently going on, and it's progressing well from what I understand. And they've got these algorithms in place. They're just working on the hardware stuff at the moment to get that working on board. Again, this comes back to our concept that the size of the data, whether it's big data or not, sort of is determined by the processing platform that we have available. And so if we start moving to edge devices, and this rover is an example of an edge device, we have to have algorithms that can be trained and then deployed and evaluated in really efficient ways. Here we have an example. This is using a pre-trained TensorFlow network to detect animals in camera trap imagery. So this is part of Andrew Shepley's research for his PhD, and it's also part of the invasive species research that goes on here in a couple of different projects at UNE. And essentially, they were using a pre-trained TensorFlow network by providing that with some additional imagery from camera traps. So they have a big data set of pre-trained camera trap imagery. They're able to take that pre-trained they're able to take the pre-trained algorithm and deploy it onto the GPUs and add the camera trap imagery to train it to detect the animals. And it works quite well. And ultimately, this will be the trained algorithm that they train on the GPUs will be then deployed to smart camera traps for the detection of invasive species. And so that project's still advancing. I believe it's got another iteration to go. And ultimately, we want to be able to get that to where we can deploy that to edge devices for detecting things like sort of wild dogs, peri-urban dogs, and also for wildlife and conservation work as well. So very interesting stuff, again, made possible by that GPU technology, really being able to train those really large networks on very large data sets. This work is a little bit more bespoke. This was some agent-based modeling done on building a preparedness model for Animal Health Australia for the old World Screwworm Fly. And so that's an insect pest that's endemic through most of Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. And it's an insect it's basically a fly that lays its eggs on open wounds on livestock and also wild animals, and it then allows other infections to occur. So it can have a significant impact on livestock production. And so there was a need for some modeling work on that to understand the level of threat and also the speed at which an invasion front, if this entered in at one of our ports or it entered in through Northern Australia, we want to know how we need to respond to that. And so we built a life cycle based individual level national scale model with a 1 by 1 kilometer resolution to simulate the movement and outbreak and movement of this pest. And so we had all sorts of weather and temperature layers in there. We also have livestock survey layers in there, and essentially each individual insect's life cycle is modeled. So they go through this life cycle where they start out as eggs, they move to a larval phase, pupa phase, and then there are female adults that ultimately lay their eggs on animals with open wounds. And so this life cycle, it's quite complex. It's also stochastic, and it's also dependent on temperature, weather conditions, humidity, and so it's a very complex complex system. And so in order to implement that, we wanted to build a model capable of actually running on a desktop machine. And so ultimately, we chose to use the NVIDIA CUDA GPU platform, and we were able to eventually get a system that would run on a laptop machine for them to run some of these trials. And so here we have just a 3-year invasion scenario where if they come in at the Port of Darwin, it shows the spread of the insect through both livestock and native animals that are present there across those years. And likewise, a spread scenario here from Brisbane, where we have lots more livestock present throughout Queensland, hitting those areas where there's a lot of wounds for them to lay their eggs. And again, a very high computational requirement there, largely coming through the interactions and that life cycle processing. On the other end of the scale, we have our big data projects. And so this was our work on looking at the movement characteristics of laying hens in production system within aviary production systems. So we had multiple production runs across 4 sheds, and each of those sheds had around about 4,000 birds per shed tagged, and they were working in this environment where we had RFID tags on the hens. We had these RFID antennas placed around at different points on the feeders, nest boxes, and also on the pop holes and on the range. So you can get an idea of the amount of time they're spending in the different locations and also the movement between them. And so this resulted in huge amounts of data, chiefly because we've got so many individual hens in the study, but also we're doing this over a sort of 54-week production cycle, or 54 weeks of the 72-week production cycle. And so the result at the end of 3 years of work on this was a database that sort of had 330 million rows records sitting in the data set. And so that's a very big data set. And that introduces a couple of problems. First of all, there's just the actual storage space is quite large, but also the need to actually use this. You have to be able to look up particular hens and their interactions with the different antennas. And so they had very big indexing structures. So an indexing structure is essentially a lookup table, and the lookup tables are almost as big as the data itself in order to get high-speed lookup enabled on these records to pull out the particular pieces of information we needed. And so we had to look at using some really efficient algorithms. So we combined those with the Postgres databases that stored them in order to look them up and then process aggregate results. And ultimately, we've only really scratched the surface of that one, looking at the transitions between the different areas within the production system. You can see here on the right hand side, we've got a nice network graph here showing the transitions that occur between the different zones. And on the left hand side, we've done some clustering work to work out whether there are subpopulations that spend more or less time in particular combinations of those locations. And so there's some evidence there that we've got some nice subpopulations that build up within the sheds. And so we're continuing on with that work, and there's more to be learnt from that data set yet to come. The final sort of class of problems that I'm going to look at today are all around collective movement and collective behavior. Collective motion is a really common phenomena that we can see in sort of flocks of birds, schools of fish. We also see it in mobs of sheep, and that's what we're really interested in. We want to understand how complex patterns emerge when individuals respond to their neighbour's position, but also the production system. We can come up with some relatively simple rules that govern their interactions that build these really impressive displays. And so here I've got a video. I apologize if you're on a lower bandwidth connection, but you can see that this is some drone footage of some sheep moving around. These sheep are being pushed around, so they're not really doing much grazing behavior, but it gives you a feel for their interactions. They have this cohesive force that causing them to all sort of clump together. Then they have these rules where they're trying to avoid their flock mates, but they're also aligning with them. And so in order to move at a higher rate, they align with their flock mates. And we can model this behavior using these three simple rules. And you can see when they interact with the production system, and this is a good example where their spacing is being compressed. You can see they fan back out. So they have a desired spacing that we're interfering with within this production system, they're going through this gate. And so it'd be really nice to understand how they move around in the systems in order to create more efficient production systems to move them around in. And so these simple rules have been modeled in many different contexts. So the three key models are the Vicsek model, the Cousin model, and the Boyd's model that Reynolds developed in the 80s. And so they're what we call zonal models. There's a zone of repulsion, a zone of alignment, and a zone of attraction. And by balancing the size of these zones and the strength of that interaction, we can build up models that demonstrate these different movements. And so I've got some videos here. This is just simple stuff where we have these collective these components, these individual particles, trying to maintain a particular alignment and a particular spacing, and they're interacting with the boundary there, bouncing off. And when they bounce off, they of course have to compress in order to turn around. And so we were investigating collisions and what effect weighting the forces differently had on the collisions and survivability of those particles. But if we tune those parameters just right, we can make some really impressive displays here. This is work that's been presented by Tim Scherf from the applied maths group here. And so by modifying the ranges of those different regions, so the zone of repulsion, orientation, and retraction, you can build different components of motion. So here we have toroidal motion that you see in shoaling fish, and we have swarming. So this is they're non-polar, they're moving all different directions, but they're maintaining cohesion. And we can have parallel motion by manipulating the zone of alignment, so that we ensure that they will align from a very long distance. And so there's a wide variety of work that looks at that particular work. Just to give you some insight into how the data is collected from different species, here we have some Antarctic krill, again collected by Tim Scherf's research group, and they were tracking these using stereoscopic cameras. And so they're able to get the movement, the three-dimensional movement of individuals there by tracking them. This is only a short segment, and getting the movement. And from that, they're able to pull out those collective movement statistics and build simulations. And so again, this is a problem that requires thousands upon thousands of iterations and trials. This particular research project heated the server room in computer science for weeks, running these trials, thousands upon thousands of trials to get the aggregate results across the thousands of individuals in each trial. And we're able to create these simulations that ultimately give us the movement patterns that are exhibited in a natural context. Now, going back to our sheep, though, some of this work's already been done by sheep. There's a European group that built a simple model based upon the Vicsek collective movement model that had sort of three broad behaviors: standing, grazing, and running. And so they had an experimental setup. This is from the supplementary material from their paper, where they took some vision and were able to use computer vision techniques to track the individual sheep. And so you can see from these videos, they're a little unclear because they're low resolution, but sheep essentially, they graze in their normal behavior, and they're what we call selfish herders. When they sense some form of danger, they clump back up, they flock back up in a very rapid movement. And that's what we call selfish herding. They're trying to minimize the distance from predators. They're minimizing the area that they're closest to a predator, and they do that by running to the center of the flock. And sort of other research has demonstrated that the fittest animals end up in the center of the flock, where there's the lowest amount of danger. And so this behavior is conflicted against the need to explore and graze. And so we'd like to extend this model. We've done the initial implementation here, and you can see the blue is the standing sheep, the green are the grazing sheep. And as they graze out, eventually we speed this one up, they graze out to a point that they transition back into their clumping behavior. When they transition in, they have to then move back down they have to then re-stabilize out into their grazing behavior so that they can continue exploring. Now, in this particular model, this has been reproduced from that research. It only looked at the interactions between the individuals. It didn't look at any of the interaction with the production system, or in particular with the biomass. The whole reason they're grazing is because they're exploring. And when they explore, the flock is like one giant group of sensors. Each of those individuals is able to sense attractive biomass. And so as if they work as a collection, that information transfer between the individuals is likely to aid in their foraging ability. So if you have the larger the group, the more sensors, the more capable the group is of finding the desirable biomass. And so the next step in this research is to extend that model ultimately to understand how that particular imperative, this idea of searching for biomass, is built into their collective behavior, and how collective behavior aids that. And so the really obvious problem is, how do we get data on that? How do we track the individual sheep? Of course, for years, this has been done using GPS devices. We've sort of upped our game a little bit, though, by using real-time kinematic GNSS devices. So here we've got an example of the MLID system. This MLID system consists of a base station, which is this large device, and this smaller rover device down here sitting straight in front of it, along with an antenna. And so we're able to mount that smaller device in a collar that goes on an individual sheep. And we have that base device that's set up in the paddock, or set up at a known location. And by collecting the raw GPS data from both of those, we can then calculate a very accurate GPS solution. And so the solution is actually accurate to about 2 centimeters once we get 6 or more satellites visible. And so we get these really high resolution tracks of the sheep. And we've tested this, done an initial test of this. We've got some sample data around here on a small flock of 5 sheep running through here. And so it's a bit messy at the start, where we're putting collars on them, getting them out of the yards into our paddock here, indicated by our blue area. But to give you an idea of the accuracy that you can get from this stuff, here we have some zoomed in segments. And so you can see each of the ticks on the bottom here is roughly 5 meters. And we go right into sort of half a meter. You can get down to a level of detail where you can see the head moving from side to side. So these are in collars mounted on their neck. And so you can get grazing behavior just from head movements, and get that level of accuracy that we've never really had before. And it produces lots of data. These were running at 10 hertz. So there were huge amounts of data coming off them. We'll probably slow those down when we deploy them in larger trials. But ultimately, we want to be able to get them to where we can collect data to inform these collective motion models. Going to finish up with something a little bit lighter, though, and it does tie into the sheep research. We've been using computer vision-based systems to track players on sporting fields. So one of the problems you have with sporting teams is that they're competitive. They don't share data. So it's very difficult to get positional data for both teams of players in a sporting game. And so we've been experimenting with tracking algorithms. So in particular, the channel and spatial reliability tracking algorithms. There's an OpenCV as a library that's available for a range of different programming platforms. And we've been using that to track individual players on the field, and then go through a process of doing some lens correction and what we call a homography transform to ultimately map the individual pixel coordinates, and the coordinates of these tracks, over to real world coordinates in meters. And we've been able to do that using the known field markings on that. And so we have these cool displays where we can track the individual players. Here we've only got one team tagged, but we're able to tag all players on the field, including players from the other side, and get their movement characteristics, which allows us to do this collective movement analysis on both sides. And so this technology has, we're aiming to apply this also to the livestock to give us another way to track the movement of, we're going to use it on a sheep trial initially in a confined area to track their movement. So that allows us to increase the sizes of the flocks without the need to outlay huge amounts of money on collars. So it's kind of quite exciting because it allows us to collect really large amounts of data, also both in terms of the process data for the point coordinates, but also that video data. And again, that's where we end up with a big data problem. We've got to store all of that, process it, and get the meaning out of it. So it's really challenging stuff. We've also been working on Rugby League as well. This is a Rugby Sevens game that we tracked. We don't have the video feed for that one available. It's one of my PhD students spent a lot of time building this up. And so you can see here, you've got the two lines where we've tracked both teams moving. We've got the ball carrier indicated by the cross here, and we're able to get movement statistics out of that for both sides and come up with some really cool displays of things like the surface areas, and these are polarization and rotation of those teams to work out how that relates to gameplay and performance. And we've even done this on soccer to investigate the degree to which soccer teams adopt swarm, polarized, and milling formations that we see in fish. In soccer, and you can see that they're both polarized and swarming for most of their time. And so that allows us to do some really cool research. Again, very high processing overhead to build that stuff up. All of this that was done on our departmental server, chewing up hundreds of hours of processing time. So we might wrap things up there. Just before I go, before I finish up though, we've got a few resources here. So if you're interested in learning more about these high performance computing platforms and the technologies that you need to learn essentially to access them, Intersect Australia is the high performance computing provider that most universities are involved with or are linked to for their high performance computing assets. And most institutions have some sort of an allowance with them, a monthly allowance or a yearly allowance in terms of the processing cores, processing power, and data storage that they can provide. And so you can jump onto their website, and they've got a bunch of training courses that allows you to sort of learn how to access those technologies. We've also got the National Computing Infrastructure. This covers off on the actual machines that are available. If you're with a higher education institution, you'll probably access that through Intersect, through your Intersect rep. But that gives you an idea of the processing capabilities and data storage that's available. And we've also got parallel programming courses. The UNE one is the unit that I run. If you want to enroll in that one, we can probably arrange a non-award enrollment into that if you're a student interested in learning some more about parallel and distributed computing. And so a bit of a multifaceted presentation there, but we've covered off on some of our processing technologies, where that scale in our processing comes from, and a bit of a roadshow on how we've applied these technologies to some current agricultural ecology and a little bit of sports science at their research at the end there. So thanks for listening, guys. If you've got any questions, fire them away, and otherwise I'll hand back over to Dave.
Thanks, Mitch. And everyone, please a reminder, if you do have questions for Mitch, just pop them into the Q&A tab, and we'll work through them. I've got a couple for you anyway, just an interesting one, which I'll get to secondly. First of all, the many examples you gave, it's obviously been observed that you're referring a lot to your departmental server. Were there any examples that really leaned into that NCI? Or have you got examples of sorts of work that have used the NCI and in fact required it?
So moving back through there, the NCI, we've only used it a couple of times. So there was a couple of those really big machine learning problems we used to train. We grabbed about 1,000 cores off the NCI machine to train a couple of those. So that would have been some of the deep learning stuff there for the ecology. Training on those neural networks, and that we haven't had extensive use for it going beyond that departmental server level, but that's where we find those ones. So you don't have to access the whole NCI platform. You can access subsets of it, so as much or as little as you want. Typical other examples of that in the wider university were looking at gene flow through environments. There's some packages that there's some pre-built packages for doing genetic flow in environments. And I know there's quite a few projects that chew up our monthly quota looking at that stuff as well. So there are some small projects that use that, but typically they don't take up the whole of the NCI infrastructure. They only take up a small subset. So it takes a very big project to get up to that one.
But on that subject, so you mentioned there's some interaction points with the NCI. So a question here is, in terms of accessing it in practice, what's the process So do all our host universities, for example, have that sort of doorway access, or does it need to go through specialist groups?
It should go. At most institutions, there should be an intersect rep or a representative. If we look